Hi everyone, my name's Diabedor, and today I'm going to show you how to make the ultimate Sword of Night and Flame build in Elden Ring. The Sword of Night and Flame is a straight sword that scales with both intelligence and faith. Its Ash of War can either do an intelligence scaling magic laser beam, or it can do a faith scaling wave of fire, both of which can do enormous damage. It's tempting to try to build it for both intelligence and faith at the same time, but unless you're a really high level, it's best to build it for one or the other. So today I'm going to show you two separate builds, one for intelligence and one for faith. Make sure you check out the timestamps in the description so you can go to the one that you want to play with. And if you find this video helpful, please leave a like, share the video, and consider subscribing. It really helps me out. First, I'm going to show you both variants of this build. We're going to do the intelligence variant and then the faith variant, where I'll talk about the different stats, weapons, talismans, armor, spells, and buffs that we'll be using for both versions of the build. Then I'll show you a quick leveling guide so that you can see how to level up your stats for either build as you play throughout the game. And then finally, I'll give you a brief gameplay showcase where I'll give you tips and tricks about how to use these builds most effectively. We're going to start off with the intelligence variant of this build. As usual, I make my builds at level 125 using the Wretch as my starting class. These are just my personal preferences, and you can make this build at any level using any class. If you're making this build from scratch, then I recommend you use the Vagabond as your starting class, because it should get the most optimal stat distribution. Our first stat is Vigor, and we've got that at 60. Vigor is by far the most important and valuable stat in this game for several reasons, but to keep it brief, I'm just going to say that it doesn't matter how cool your laser sword is if you die in one hit because you didn't get 60 Vigor. So make sure you got 60 Vigor. After that, we've got Mind. This is our dump stat, which we level up last after all the important stuff. I ended up having a couple points left over to bring it up to 23, and I recommend keeping it to at least 20 because this is going to be an FP hungry build. Next, we've got Endurance. I went with 17 because that's the minimum required to medium roll with the Rakshasa set, the sword, the Staff of the Great Beyond, and the talismans we're going to use. I'll talk about the gear more in a little bit, but if you don't have the Rakshasa set and you use the Knight Armor instead, you can bring Endurance down to around 12 or 13 and use those extra points in Intelligence or Mind. For our damage stats, we've got the minimum 12 strength and dex required to wield the sword. Its main focus is elemental damage, and that scales with either intelligence or faith, so we don't need more than the bare minimum strength and dex. The sword also requires 24 intelligence and faith to wield, and the Golden Vow incantation, and also the Staff of the Great Beyond, requires 25 faith to use, and the staff wants 25 intelligence. So I put that one extra point into faith because it's worth being able to use the Golden Vow spell. And finally, because the magic variant of the Ash of War scales with intelligence, I dumped a bunch of points into intelligence and ended up with 45. Depending on your starting class, you may end up with a bit less intelligence, but you're going to want at least 40 for our spell requirements and to get good damage with the laser. That's it for the stats, so now let's talk about our weapons, talismans, and armor. For weapons, we've obviously got the Sword of Night and Flame, and we've also got the Staff of the Great Beyond. This staff is unique because it can cast both sorceries and incantations, and its requirements of 25 int and faith happen to coincide nicely with the requirements for the sword. It's a DLC item, however, so if you don't have access to it, then you can replace it with the Golden Order seal to cast incantations, such as Golden Vow, and also keep an Academy Glintstone staff equipped for casting sorceries. For our talismans, we've got the Magic Scorpion Charm, which increases all magic damage you do by 12% at the cost of taking 10% more physical damage. This is worth the trade-off, and we've got a bunch of defensive spells to make up for it anyway. We've got Rilana's Cameo, which will buff the sword's Ash of War by a ridiculous 45% after you hold its stance for 1 second. This talisman alone is basically what makes the weapon worth using. Then we've got the Shard of Alexander to boost the Ash of War by another 15%, and finally we've got the Dragon Crest Great Shield to increase our physical damage negation by 20%, which more than makes up for the debuff from the Scorpion Charm. If you don't have the DLC and you can't use Rilana's Cameo, then you can swap it out for the Ritual Sword Talisman, which buffs all damage you do by 10% while you're at full health. It's not nearly as strong, but it'll still work pretty well. You can also use the Ritual Sword Talisman in place of the Magic Scorpion Charm in case you already completed Ronnie's quest and you can't do Celavis's quest to get it. Finally, for armor, we've got the Rakshasa set, which provides more than 50 poise and boosts all damage you do by 2% per piece worn, for a total of about 8% when wearing the full set. I see people get concerned about the damage taken debuff from the armor, and the way it works is slightly complicated for no particular reason, but basically, the armor still provides good protection, and you shouldn't worry too much about the debuff. If you don't have the DLC, and you don't have access to the Rakshasa armor, then you can use the Knight armor instead, which is just solid armor that provides good protection and poise. That's it for our gear, so now let's move on to the spells and buffs that we're going to use. You've got 25 Faith, which grants us access to several buff incantations. First is Blessing's Boon, which gives you health regen at a rate of 8 health per second for 90 seconds. Then we've got Golden Vow, which increases all damage you do by 15% and reduces all damage you take by 10% for 80 seconds. And finally, we've got Terra Magica, which creates a circle on the ground that'll boost all magic damage you do by 22.5% while you stand in it. With these spells combined together, you're going to be pretty tanky and do a fuckload of damage. I also included Night Comet and Carrion Slicer because we've got a bunch of intelligence. They're solid spells that help to round out your moveset when you don't have good opportunities to use the Ash of War, which I'll talk about in the gameplay showcase. There's also Flame Cleanse Me, which you won't see in the picture here, but it's an incantation that'll cure you of poison or rot, and it's always good to keep equipped just in case you run into those effects. As for our physic tiers, we've got the Opaline Hard tier, which increases all your damage negation by 15% for 3 minutes, and the Magic Shred and Crack tier, which increases all magic damage you do by 20% for 3 minutes. If you have the DLC, then you may want to swap the Opaline Hard tier out for the Bloodsuck and Crack tier, which increases all damage you do by 20%, but also drains your health by 23 points per second for 3 minutes. I personally don't care for the health drain, which is why I don't use it, but that 20% damage buff is very strong, and you can use it if you want to see really big numbers. That was it for the intelligence variant of this build, so now let's talk about the faith variant. For our stats, we've still got 60 vigor, because it's by far the most important and valuable stat in the game. Again, doesn't matter how cool your sword looks if the enemy kills you before you can get an attack out, so make sure you've got 60 vigor. We've got 22 mind here. Mind is our dump stat, and we worry about it after getting the stats we require for the rest of the build. I recommend having at least 20 mind, because this build is going to eat up a lot of FP. Up next, we've got 16 endurance, which is the minimum required to medium roll with the heaviest gear this build can use. If you don't have the Rakshasa armor from the DLC, and you use the Knight armor instead, then you can bring this down to about 12 or 13 and put the extra points into faith or mind instead. For our damage stats, we've got the minimum 12 strength and dex required for the sword. The elemental damage is the focus of the build, and that scales with intelligence or faith, so those are the stats we focus on. You've got the minimum 24 intelligence required to wield the sword, and since we're going to use the Staff of the Great Beyond to cast spells, I put 1 extra point into intelligence because the staff requires 25 int. And finally, we've got 47 faith because the fire variant of the Ash of War scales with faith. Depending on your starting class, you may have slightly more or fewer points in faith here, and I recommend having a minimum of 40 so you can cast all of the spells we're going to be using and get good damage with the Ash of War. Up next are the weapons, talismans, and armor. Again, we've obviously got the Sword of Night and Flame, and we also have the Staff of the Great Beyond because it fits in well with our stats and can cast both sorceries and incantations. I didn't actually include any sorceries in this version of the build, so if you don't have the DLC or you want to save a point or two in endurance, you can just use the Golden Order seal instead. For talismans, we've got the Fire Scorpion Charm, which increases all fire damage you do by 12% at the cost of taking 10% more physical damage. That debuff is worth the trade-off, and we're going to use some defensive buffs to make up for it anyway. Then we've got Rolana's Cameo, which increases the sword's Ash of War damage by an insane 45% after holding its stance for 1 second. This talisman single-handedly makes this sword worth using. Then we've got the Shard of Alexander to buff the Ash of War by another 15%, and we've got the Dragon Crest Great Shield to increase our physical damage negation by 20%, which more than makes up for the debuff from the Scorpion Charm. If you don't have the DLC, then you can swap out Rolana's Cameo for the Ritual Sword Talisman, which increases all damage you do by 10% while at full health. It's not nearly as strong, but it's still a solid buff. For armor, we're using the Rakshasa set, which provides good poise and will increase all damage you do by 2% for each piece worn, for a total of around 8%. I see people get concerned about the damage taken debuff from the armor, and the way it works is slightly complicated for no particular reason, but basically, the armor still provides good protection, and you shouldn't worry too much about the debuff. If you don't have the DLC, and you can't use the Rakshasa set, then you can use the Knight armor instead, which is just solid armor that provides good poise and protection with relatively low weight. That's it for the gear, so let's move on to the spells and buffs. We've got fairly high faith, which gives us access to a ton of buff incantations. First off is Blessing of the Erd Tree, which gives you health regeneration at a rate of 12 health per second for 90 seconds. Then we've got Golden Vow, which increases all damage you do by 15% and reduces all damage you take by 10% for 80 seconds. After that, we've got Howl of Shabriri, which increases all damage you do by 25%, but increases all damage you take by 30% for 45 seconds. Our defensive buffs more than make up for the damage taken increase, but if it's not working out for you, then you can swap Howl over to Flame Grant Me Strength instead, which just increases all physical and fire damage you do by 20% for 30 seconds, and also provides some extra stamina regen. I also included Flame Cleanse Me, which you can use to cure yourself of poison or rot, so that comes in handy in case you run into those. And finally, I included Catch Flame and Giant's Flame Take Thee, which are solid incantations that work well with our buffs and help to round out your moveset in case you're in a situation where the Ash of War isn't a great option. Finally, for our physic tiers, I used the Opaline Hard tier, which increases all damage negation by 15% for 3 minutes, and the Flame Shrouding Crack tier, which increases all fire damage you do by 20% for 3 minutes. If you have the DLC, then you may want to swap out the Opaline Hard tier for the Blood-Sucking Crack tier, which increases all damage you do by 20%, but will drain your health by 23 points per second for 3 minutes. I personally don't care for the health drain, so I don't use it, but it's a very strong buff, and if you use it, you'll see some stupid damage numbers. That's it for both of the builds, so now let's move on to the leveling guide, where I'll show you how to level up for this build as you play through the game. First, we're going to do the leveling guide for the intelligence variant of this build. We're starting off at level 71 because this sword has some ridiculously high stat requirements of 12 strength, 12 dexterity, and 24 intelligence and faith. This is a big part of why this sword kinda sucks, and so unless you're already a fairly high level, you really shouldn't use it. With that said, level 71 is the first milestone that we're going to start at because we can have 40 vigor as well as the minimum stats required to wield the sword, and I also put 5 points into mind to bring that up to 15, and 2 points into endurance to bring that up to 12. So with 15 mind, we just have a little bit of FP to work with when we're casting the buffs or using the sword itself. You're not running out of FP every 2 casts. And then with the 12 endurance, I figure while you're still in the early game, you're going to be using the Knight set because you can get that at the Round Table Hold. And so you don't need the full 16 or 17 endurance for the Rakshasa set. You'll also see I have Faith at 25 because it's just 1 point over the minimum required to use the sword, and that gives us access to all the buffs that we're going to be using, including Golden Vow. Moving on to level 100, I brought Intelligence up to 40. That'll hit the first Intelligence soft cap and make sure that we're doing pretty good damage with the sword. Make sure you're also upgrading it, of course. And then I also put a couple points into Mind to bring that up to 20. That way we have pretty good Mind overhead for, casting the buffs and using the sword. I brought Endurance up to 17, which is our final Endurance level, because that way we can, equip all the gear that this build is going to use, which you are likely to have at this point. And then finally, I put the remaining points into Vigor, bringing it up to 43, because around level 100 is when you want to start working towards getting 60 Vigor. We're going to skip to level 150, because I just spent 15 minutes talking about level 125. So at this point, you should have 60 Vigor, which we had at level 125. I brought Mind up to 25 because I had a couple extra points to work with, and so you might as well just start leveling up Mind. We still have 17 Endurance, 12 Strength, 12 Dex. I brought Intelligence up to 68 because that's what this Ash of War variant scales with, and then I left Faith at 25. After this, we're going to start leveling up Faith too, because we're at such a high level where you might as well just make it an Int Faith build instead of mostly an Int build. So finally, at level 200, we've got 60 Vigor, 25 Mind, 17 Endurance. I brought Intelligence up to 72, and I brought Faith up to 71. We're at a point where putting more points into Intelligence or Faith isn't going to do all that much for the damage. So instead of trying to focus on the one and getting like an extra like 5 or 6% by bringing that up to 80, I figured might as well just average them out and bring them both up to about 70. So that way, now that you're at a pretty high level, at level 200, you can use this weapon, in either configuration without having to change your stats all the time. Now we're going to talk about leveling the Faith variant of this build. So again, we start at level 71 because again, this sword has ridiculously high stat requirements involving both 24 Intelligence and 24 Faith. Part of the reason why this sword sucks. I already mentioned that in the previous version leveling guide, so I'm not going to go over this again. So at level 71, we've got 40 Vigor, because Vigor is super important, 15 Mind, and 12 Endurance. That way we have a little bit of FP overhead for actually using the Ash of War, and the Endurance lets us wear the Knight armor, because chances are you won't have access to the Rakshasa armor yet at this level. And then we've got the minimum required 12 Strength and Dexterity, and we've got the minimum required 24 Intelligence and Faith, and then I put 1 extra point into Faith, so that we have access to Golden Vow and most of the incantations that we're going to be using. Moving up to level 100, I put another point into Intelligence to bring it up to 25, so that we have the requirements to use the Staff of the Great Beyond. I brought Faith up to 40, because that's the first soft cap, and so that'll make sure we were doing pretty good damage. I brought Endurance up to 17, so that we have the maximum endurance that we need to be able to use all the gear, including the Rakshasa armor. And then I put a couple points into Mind to bring it up to 20, so we have some more FP to work with. And with the leftover points, I put Vigor up to 43, because around level 100 is when I like to start working on getting 60 Vigor. We're going to skip level 125, because I talked about that in the build overview. Moving on to level 150, we've got 60 Vigor, which we had at level 125, 22 Mind, which we had at 125, 16 Endurance. So there's a discrepancy here, because in the previous one I said 17 Endurance. 16 is the minimum required for using the Staff of the Great Beyond. If you use a different staff, then you're going to need 1 more point into Endurance, but don't worry too much about it. Just go with 16 or 17 Endurance. It's basically the same thing. We've got still the minimum required Strength and Dexterity of 12. We've got 25 Intelligence, because we don't need more Intelligence yet. And I brought Faith up to 72, because that is what, we're using for the fire variant of this Ash of War. And after this, going up to level 200, we're going to start leveling up Intelligence, because we're at such a high level where it's not worth putting a couple more points into Faith to bring it up to 80 and get like 5% more damage out of the Ash of War. You're at such a high level where you might as well just bring up Intelligence and be able to use both of them equally well. And so you can see here, I ended up with about 71 or 72 in both Intelligence and Faith. The one you choose to bring up slightly higher is up to you. Doesn't really matter. They're about equal, and that's the point of it. So that concludes the leveling guide section of this video, and now we're going to move on to the gameplay showcase, where I'll talk about how to use this weapon and how you can get the most out of it. So first I'm going to show clips from the Intelligence variant, and then I'm going to show clips from the Faith variant. With both versions of the build, you'll want to make sure you use your buffs. I always make sure to emphasize this, because I see a lot of people not use their buffs before they start boss fights and stuff. Make sure you drink your Wondrous Physic, then cast Blessing's Boon, or Blessing the Erd Tree, then cast Golden Vow, cast Howl of Shabriri, or Flame Grant Me Strength if you have it, and then in the case of this Intelligence build, we cast Terra Magica. You also saw I used Unseen Form. That way I could let this Godskin Apostle get closer to me, and I could blast him from the circle before he could attack me. So, we have the Intelligence to use Unseen Form, which turns you semi-invisible. So, why not use it? And you saw I fucking blasted him. Does a whole bunch of damage if the boss stands still and lets you hit them with it. So the thing about the Intelligence version of this Ash of War specifically is that it's just a straight line. It's got a decent radius and like okay-ish range, but it's just a straight line, so if the boss moves out of it, then it's not hitting them. That's part of the reason why the Comet Azure spell also sucks, because even though it's this big blast that can go across the entire arena and, drain an enemy's health, all they gotta do is step to the side 1 foot, and now you're not hitting them, and you can't do anything with it. So that's why I recommend using the Faith version of this build instead of the Intelligence version, but if you have opportunities to hit it, such as by sneaking up behind an enemy, you can just blast them before they have a chance to do anything. You know, neither the Godskin Apostle nor this Draconic Tree Sentinel even got a single attack off before I was able to kill him with it, because with all the buffs that we're doing, it just does so much damage that it's ridiculous, you know? So now, I want to contrast that with this Elmer of the Briar fight, because you're going to see that he attacks too often. You know, I don't have an opportunity to hit him with it. Especially considering that we're using Rolana's cameo, which is a huge damage boost, 45%. That's enormous. I didn't even have time to get it off there, and I barely hit him with it. I should have stepped forward more. But yeah, you gotta hold the stance for 1 second before you do it, and combined with the long casting animation of the, you know, Ash of War, you don't always have opportunities to get it off. So that's why I included a spell like Carrion Slicer, for example, which you see me using here. If you can't use the Ash of War, then you can make up for it by using a spell like Carrion Slicer to do a ton of damage. Now you see, here I'm hitting him with the sword, and the damage it's doing is kind of middling compared to Carrion Slicer. So the thing about the Sword of Night and Flame is that it does 3-way split damage. If you look at it in your inventory, it'll have a high attack rating of like 700 or 800 damage or whatever. You know, it'll have a high attack rating, but that's split up into 3 different kinds of damage. And so you see here my single damage type Carrion Slicer is doing way more damage, and also Carrion Slicer's fast as hell, so it's just melting him. But yeah, so I'm not going to talk about it here. I'll put it down in the description if you want to know why split damage sucks. But basically, because this weapon is doing 3 different damage types, it has a high total attack power, but each damage type is pretty low. And so that means that the enemy's defense stats will reduce them by a lot. Because defense, not negation, it's different from negation. Defense is more effective when the incoming damage is already low. So because the magic damage, the physical damage, and the fire damage from the sword's melee attacks are all pretty low, even though they add up to a high total attack power, the enemy's defenses reduce each of them by a lot, and you end up doing not that much damage with them. So this weapon is an Ash of War stick. You don't want to use it for melee attacks, you want to use it to blast enemies with the Ash of War. You saw there I was able to get a collateral on both the summon and Niall himself because I positioned myself. So, you know, if you have an opportunity to do a positioning-based thing like that, then go for it. But yeah, so you don't want to use this weapon for its melees, you want to use it for the Ash of War. But the thing is that you don't always have the opportunity to use the Ash of War because it takes so long to cast. So the weapon kind of sucks, you know? I really don't care that much for this weapon. It's cool, it's fun to use, but I mean, like, you know, that damage is just not great. I'd be doing way more damage if I was using Carrion Slicer there, you know? And there's really not all that much you can do about it because this thing's an Ash of War stick. If you're fighting a boss where you have big punish windows where you get to use it, then, you know, go for it. But if you don't have big punish windows on the boss, you know, like when you get one off, you see it takes off a huge chunk of health. But you don't always have punish windows, as seen there, where I could have died from that. If you're fighting a boss where you don't have big punish windows, consider using the magic, you know, like Carrion Slicer or Night Comet. Consider using those instead of trying to actually hit the enemy with the sword, because they'll do way better damage. So now in these clips, I'm using the Faith variant of the build. Now, we still have 25 intelligence because it requires 24, and we're using the Staff of the Great Beyond, so we brought it up to 25. So I still have access to Unseen Form, which gives me the opportunity to, again, sneak up behind field bosses, such as this full-grown Falling Star Beast. And so, you know, I'm able to do all my buffs and attack it while it's unaware and get a sneak attack bonus on it. You're going to see, so I drink my Physic, I cast Blessing the Yard Tree here, I'm going to cast Golden Vow, and then, so I'm using Howl of Shabriri. Something you gotta remember about Howl of Shabriri is that it's not just a buff, it's also an attack. So I actually had forgotten about that. I had to go and sneak away from him so that when I cast it, because it, unlike Golden Vow, Howl will not only hit enemies around you, which will obviously aggro them onto you, but it also makes noise. So you gotta get a good distance away so they don't hear you. But yeah, so I cast Howl there, and now I'm going to come back to this fucker, and I'm going to hit him with the Fire Wave. You can see it's going to do a bunch of damage. He is fairly weak to fire damage, but still, you know, good amount of damage, good buffs. the thing is you gotta look for opportunities to actually use it. If you don't have great opportunities to use it, then you're gonna get hit. You might get knocked out of it, you might die. I took a risk here with doing it during his phase transition, but it looked cool as hell, so it was worth doing. But you won't always have that opportunity, and that's why we've got Catch Flame with us. So you're going to watch the Onyx Lord kick my ass. You see I start off strong because while he's spawning in and I have a huge punish window, I was able to hit him with the Ash of War, but after that I don't really have any good opportunities to use it, and I also, just get owned a little bit because I'm bad. But yeah, so, I try using the sword, barely does any damage because not only does this guy have decent magic resistance, but again, the split damage on the sword is just, makes it basically worthless as a melee weapon. And so really my best option here, as you may have noticed, would have been to hit him with Catch Flame, because the Catch Flame is fast as hell and does a fuckload of concentrated fire damage. And so, that'll be your best source of DPS while you're exploring and stuff. So, yeah, really, like, if you're exploring or if you're fighting an enemy that does, like, fast attacks and stuff, you really want to use something like one of the support spells that I brought, like Catch Flame, or maybe even bring a different weapon and use that while exploring, and then switch to the Sword of Night and Flame for boss fights or whatever, when you can get the Ash of War off. When you have the opportunity to do it, you do a lot of damage with it, and you see, make sure you hold the stance for a second before you cast it, so that the Rolana's cameo buff kicks in. You gotta hold it down for 1 second, and then you can do the attack. But, that can be really detrimental, because like here, for example, I wasn't able to recover in time, and I ended up getting hit by the meteors. Fortunately, Estelle is one of the slow bosses where you're able to cast it, but even then, the casting animation is still long, so you really don't always have an opportunity to safely do it, and it can be kind of a pain in the ass to do. And something I thought about doing, so if you watch my Murray Executioner's Sword build, that weapon also has a slow Ash of War with a long casting animation and a long charge up time. But the thing about it is that it's a great sword, so what I was able to do was use the sword to get poise breaks on enemies, and then while they're stunned, I could hit them with the Ash of War. So I thought about doing that with this sword too, and like making a build out of that, but the thing is that this thing's just a straight sword, so its poise damage isn't very good, so you can't even really do that. You could do something like, I think what I did in my Rivers of Blood video, is in one clip, I used the Star Fist. So I was switching between the Star Fist to get stance breaks on the Golden Hippo, and then once it was stance broken, I would switch over to Rivers of Blood and use the Ash of War on that. You could do something like that with this weapon, but that won't even work either, because the Ash of War just takes so long to do. So by the time you get it off, the enemy's already recovered. At least with Rivers of Blood, it's got like 3 parts to the Ash of War, so you could just do the first 1 or 2 and then be able to safely dodge when the enemy recovers. But you can't even really do that with this weapon, So yeah, Sword of Night and Flame kind of sucks. I had a good time using it, which is why I decided to publish this video, but I really don't recommend using it, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. When it works, it works. As you're going to see here, this Fire Ash of War just melts this Divine Beast Dancing Lion, because he's only got, he doesn't have any fire resistance. He has 0% fire resistance. So when I hit him with the Fire Wave, it fucking melts him. But, it's not great. I could do better if I had something like, even a weapon with like the Flaming Strike Ash of War. I could get like a mace or something, or just like a straight sword. I could use Flaming Strike. Not only will that, the bullet of the attack do a bunch of damage, but it's got the follow-up hit that does a bunch of damage, and it buffs your sword, or, your weapon, with additional fire damage afterwards, so that your melee attacks are even stronger, or if you're using, like, magic stuff, you'd be better off using like the Dark Moon Greatsword, which you buff with the Ash of War, and then you can hit the enemies with the heavy attacks, and that shoots out a laser beam, and it also does frostbite buildup, so that's, even better than this thing. So yeah, I don't really recommend using this sword, but if you want to, this is basically as good of a build as you're going to get with it, and I hope you find it helpful. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, share the video, and consider subscribing because it really helps me out. My name is Diabidor, and I will catch you later.